Okay, what's going on, everybody? My name is Mangg, and today I'm going to be ranking all 13 single player main title games in the Final Fantasy series. I know it sounds pretty specific, but I don't think it's that bad. So this is Final Fantasy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, 13, and 15. No spin-offs, no side games, and no MMOs. Only the 13 main titles. I mean, some people may throw in the MMOs in their rankings. I'm sure plenty of people do, but for my money, those are just not meant to be. Those are just no. Just no. It's not the same thing at all. So just about 10 minutes ago, I finished beating the final boss in my final Let's Play for my Final Fantasy series. So they have all been beaten now. And much like my Zelda series, it's time to rank them. My opinions on them. Although this time I think it's more legit because I've actually beaten them all. So yeah. Again, these are just my opinions. It doesn't mean anything at all. And they're like anytime I do a ranking list, it's gonna be like if you ask me in a week, I may have put this one higher than this one or this one lower than this one. They might shuffle around a little bit, but the top three, bottom three are pretty set in stone. The middle, yeah, that's where there might be some deviation, but yeah. So Final Fantasy, first game was originally released in Japan in 1987, the end of 1987, and it didn't come to America until 1990. I did not play the original game when I was a young lad. My first Final Fantasy was probably 4, but the first one I remember playing was 6. So I didn't really jump into the series until probably 95, 96. Final Fantasy 6 came out over here as Final Fantasy 3 on the Super Nintendo. I think in 94. Maybe 95. I don't know exactly. Wikipedia is just saying 94. So I guess. But I doubt I played it on launch day. So, around then, I was a young person. I was probably 5 or 6 when I first started playing Final Fantasy. And so, yeah, it's been a part of my gaming life for decades. And, I haven't always, kept up with the series. I'm not, a devout fanatic of the series. There are times that I have sort of grown away from it. And there was a time when I was pretty much done with it. So I thought. When Final Fantasy 12 came out, I thought I was done with that series. That did not interest me at all because they broke away from turn-based or ATB for the most part. And then Final Fantasy 13 came out and seemed to do pretty much the same thing, and I thought I was done. Yeah, so clearly I was not done because I made the decision to play through all the games, and I'm very glad that I did. Very glad. Certainly renewed my interest and my respect for the series. So let's get into it. First up, though, we have some alternate categories before we get to the main attraction here. Just a few side things. First up is the best character in the series. I limited it to only playable characters. This is only PCs, protagonists, whatever you want to call it. Only characters that you actually get to control. For for a significant amount of time. So, like Final Fantasy VII, yeah, you get to control Sephiroth for like a minute, but that I didn't want to count that. Just this is best playable character. So the runner-ups, first you got Auron from Final Fantasy X. He's definitely the best character in Final Fantasy X. There's no doubt about that. Very cool dude. A great contrast, I'll say, to Titus. Very badass dude. Even Spoonie had to respect Auron. Then Barret from Final Fantasy VII. Yeah, I'd probably say Barret is the best character in Final Fantasy VII, at least for my money. Just just sort of B.A. Baracus, but in a video game with a big gun on his arm. But he cares for his adopted daughter, and he's got a good backstory. I like Barret a lot, and he swears a lot. That's a plus. Then, surprisingly, from Final Fantasy 12, I threw Balthier in here as a runner-up. Definitely the best character in that game. I thought his voice actor did a really good job, and he's the leading man. So, I didn't care much about the story in Final Fantasy 12, but I thought Balthier was pretty cool. But alright, the actual best character in the Final Fantasy series is, of course, drumroll, Cyan from Final Fantasy VI. I mean, come on, you knew I was going to pick a Final Fantasy VI character. But, yeah, Cyan is potentially, like, the most honorable character in the entire series. He's got just a tragic story as part of his character. Losing, his wife and his child to this plague, or to this poison. But he keeps soldiering on. He's on the ghost train, and he has to watch them depart to the next world, and it's just like, oh my god, but he keeps fighting. Even after the world has gone to ruin. Things have never been more bleak. He keeps going. Really touching stuff. Definitely the character that I care about most. And just one badass dude. So, Cyan, Garamond, best character in Final Fantasy. Alright, conversely then, we have the worst character. The absolute worst playable character protagonist in the series. There's a good number of them, I would say. But, again, this is just my opinion, so brace yourselves. Runner-ups. First we have, again, from Final Fantasy VI, the opposite end of the spectrum is Gao. Gao. That little piece of shit. I didn't care about him in 1995, and I don't care about him in 2018. Alright? He's just a stupid little piece of shit, and he's got abandoned in the Veldt, and that's where he should stay. Then you have, from Final Fantasy IX, Kina, who is some sort of creature, and has no point in the story, does not need to exist as a character, and I couldn't care less. And yeah, you could also say that about Vaughn, I guess. But anyways, then you have from Final Fantasy XIII, I'm sure you've already guessed it, Snow. Spoonie hated Snow quite a bit more than I did, but yeah, it's just not a likable character. It's not someone you want to be buddies with, and that's I want to be buddies with Cyan and Auron and Barret. I don't want to be buddies with Snow. But alright, the absolute worst character in the series is Squall from Final Fantasy VIII. Squall is really just sort of unacceptable to me. If he was like an ancillary character, if he was just on the sidelines and he joined your party and he was just sort of the loner and the emo kind of character, and you could have him tag along if you wanted. It's sort of like damn, what the hell is his name? Hold on, give me a second. This is important to me. Amaranth. If he was like Amaranth in Final Fantasy IX, I'd give him a pass. I would. Because it's just like, alright, he's there, he's the emo guy, whatever. He's like Amaranth. But no, Squall is the main fucking character. And his attitude and dialogue throughout that game are just unacceptable to me. I'm sorry. Maybe some people like it. Again, this is my opinion. But when he's just going through the whole story and just being like, whatever, I don't care, whatever. Like, that's not interesting to me at all. And I know I don't care about characters and story much, but even I have to sometimes perk my ears up and be like, what is this? Squall is worse than Cloud by a large degree. And so if he was a side character, it'd be fine. But since he is the main character of his game, he is the worst character in the series, as far as I'm concerned. Alright. I'm sure some people are going to bring up Titus or who knows what. Go ahead. Alright, next. The hottest character. I'm sure some people making this list would just list all the main characters from Final Fantasy 15 or something like that. But this is purely from a male hetero perspective. Apologies, but that's just putting this out there. So, runner-ups first from Final Fantasy 9. We have Beatrix. Because she's just a badass, like, she's really like a 3D version of Celis from Final Fantasy 6. Which, I guess Celis could be up there as well. I didn't list her. I guess they're sort of interchangeable. But I don't know. Beatrix does the job. Then from Final Fantasy 15, you have Cindy. I mean, that's a pretty obvious one. Her entire character is designed. She was like designed by committee to be the hottest character in Final Fantasy, and she got up there. She got up there. Pretty damn hot, but not quite enough. Also, we have from Final Fantasy VIII, Quistis, for very obvious reasons. Yes, but none of those quite compare. I think if you've watched my whole playthroughs, all the videos, you probably can guess which one I thought. Since I made a stink about it, I brought it up. The hottest character is, of course, from Final Fantasy 15, and that is Aranea Highwind. Yeah, she's got, like, silverly blonde hair. She's a Highwind, which is... Well, she's a Dragoon, which is, yes, but not only is she a Dragoon, she's a Highwind, which is, like, the upper echelon, the highest echelon of Dragoons. That's the OG Dragoon. And she's a badass. Beyond that. And she's got big boobs. So it's the whole package. Everything you want. Aranea Highwind. Hottest character. Alright, but then the final thing before we get to the main rankings. I know I'm dragging this out. We have the best Cid. All the Cids throughout all the series. Which one is the absolute best? Well, for runner-ups, first we have Final Fantasy II. Now, this is the OG Cid. This is the first Cid in the whole series, because Final Fantasy 1 didn't really do much with anything. So, Final Fantasy 2 is the first appearance of Cid. And that alone would probably qualify him to be a runner-up, but he's actually a pretty decent version of Cid in Final Fantasy 2. He's a bit of a, that sort of gruffer, sort of, badass kind of Cid. So, I like that version of Cid quite a bit. So that's first runner-up. Then you have Final Fantasy 6, Gramps. I mean, that's just near and dear to my heart. Trying to keep him alive, and he kept Celis alive throughout the whole ordeal, and he's just one of those quality, real grandpa versions of Cid. And then of course you have Final Fantasy VIII, the professor, the dean Cid, Robin Williams. I really just put him in there because he reminds me of Robin Williams. I don't know if that was intentional or not. I don't think so, because if you look at the end game, like, cinematic, where he's in there, he looks more like Philip Seymour Hoffman ish than Robin Williams, but yeah, there you go. But the best Cid, of course, is from Final Fantasy VII, Cid Highwind. Again, if you're carrying the Highwind name, there's just that pedigree, you know. You're just that next step up. So this is Cid as a proper Dragoon, pretty much. But he's chain smoking. He's swearing all the time. Oh my gosh, he's just so crotchety and badass. And he's just flying fucking rockets around and shit. He's just great. He was definitely the best version of Cid. There's almost no real competition. And, I mean, believe me, it's not like I have some erection for Final Fantasy VII. I'm not one of those types of people. It's just very clear that Cid Highwind is the best Cid. It's really the end of it. Alrighty, let's get to the actual rankings, though. Here we go. Number 13. Funnily enough, is Final Fantasy 13. Yeah, so Final Fantasy 13. It's not like the greatest departure of gameplay from the rest of the series. It's really not. That goes to Final Fantasy 15 pretty clearly. It's just the weakest iteration of gameplay within the series. Now, as I've said many times throughout the playthroughs, and if you didn't watch any of those, you're just watching this, let me make it clear. I do not really care about story or characters at all. You know, I'll try to keep attention, pay attention to the story if I can, unless it gets really off the rails. And, I read dialogue and all that kind of stuff. But I play video games for gameplay. That's it. Everything else is just secondary. So, I can go in here, I can discuss game design and all that kind of stuff for you, but when it comes down to it, it's just a level of enjoyment. And if I have to rank it, which is what I'm doing, I rank 13 as the one I enjoyed the least. I don't really have to explain it. That's just the way that it is. Maybe... It's not a terrible game. Like, it's not like I was sitting there even at the end of the game being like, oh god, this is just atrocious or anything like that. It's really just sort of, I don't know, kind of blasé to me. It was just, alright, I'm going through the motions. I'm going through the motions of playing through this game because I want to play through every game in the series. But this is not a game that I would ever play through again. And that was a big factor in how I ranked this, is which of these am I most likely to play again? And 13 is at the bottom of that list. Every game beyond this one, I am more likely to play again than 13. And so for that reason, it's at the bottom of the list. Not that it's atrocious. Some people may say it is. That's fine, but it just is what it is, and that's not something I want to replay. It was fine for one time. Again, I don't regret playing through it or anything like that. But that's the end of my time with Final Fantasy 13. So that's why it is number 13. And I don't think that really shocks too many people that watch through the series. All right, number 12 then is Final Fantasy 8. Yeah. Final Fantasy 8 is good for one reason, and that's Triple Triad. And they even managed to fuck that up, because halfway through the game, they start throwing you out all these shitty rules, and if you want to play by some specific rules, you have to jump through all these hoops and shit just to get it back to what you want to play with. And it's just ridiculous. I just want to play regular Triple Triad. Like, my best times with Final Fantasy VIII were like the first few hours when I was just playing Triple Triad all over the place and collecting cards. That was my best time with that game. Game went downhill from there. Yeah, so Final Fantasy VIII does a bunch of things differently as far as gameplay is concerned. from the rest of the series. They have no equipment, which was, a staple of every game up to that point. In Final Fantasy VII, it was pretty minimal. But even then, it was a thing. You had equipment. You had better equipment than other equipment. So Final Fantasy VIII threw that out, and instead you had the junction system, which isn't the worst idea in the world. It sounds interesting on paper. But when it comes down to it, at least from my perspective, you either do triple triad and you become overpowered very quickly, or you don't do triple triad at all because you don't know about that whole process, and you're like Spoony, and you just draw magic over and over so that you can raise your power, because that's pretty much what it comes down to. Or you just sort of do not a hybrid, but you just sort of try and play through the game normally, and that doesn't sound very interesting to me either. I just don't think the junction system works as well as it did on paper, I guess. Beyond that, though, there's just not that much interesting things to do. Even the final boss, all I did was attack. Physical attack. That's pretty much it. Maybe there were some spells thrown in there, but it's just almost nothing. You have summons, but it's just pretty much inferior to your physical attacks. And so, I don't know, I just like more variety in combat. And I like characters that are different within gameplay. I like characters that have their own different abilities and stuff like that. Whether it's a job system or they're just different classes from the start. Final Fantasy VIII, both times that I've played it, every character is identical. All that matters is their junctions. Yes, they have different limit breaks, but that hardly comes up. Because you can't really plan that out, not like Final Fantasy VII. So every character is just a cardboard representation of some stats, which is just not appealing from a gameplay perspective. So Final Fantasy VIII just doesn't really work for me. Again, Squall, this is the worst character, so that bothers me on that aspect. And overall, the game is just a much worse version of Final Fantasy VII or Final Fantasy IX. That's it. I mean, I prefer 2D Final Fantasies for the most part. So for it to be a good 3D Final Fantasy, and I'm going to play it, there are just better ones than 8. And, when I was younger and we played Final Fantasy VIII for the first time, me and my brother both hated it. Thought it was terrible. Now, we didn't understand it, and so I thought playing through this series that, okay, now that I understand it, maybe it'll be a lot better. It's better, but not that much. Number 11 is Final Fantasy XII. So Final Fantasy XII is one of the biggest departures in gameplay for the series, going away from having a separate battle screen entirely and just having it be more like an MMO where you approach monsters and you have the combat right there on the same screen. And along with that, it's completely... Well, to say it's real time, I suppose, is a little disingenuous. There is a delay between your actions, I suppose, which is, a lot like the other later Final Fantasies, 6 and 7 and all that. They have the ATB system. So I guess 12 is sort of an evolution of the ATB system, but it's meant to appear more akin to like a real-time action-type game. The problem with Final Fantasy XII is also sort of the pro side of it. Well, the thing that balances it all out is the Gambit system. The Gambit system is there to help you handle combat and to make it more interesting. Now, if the combat was more akin to Final Fantasy X, I wouldn't need a Gambit system. Final Fantasy X, I have no interest in having a Gambit system. And I wouldn't need it in 12 if it was that same type of play. But since it's more automated by design, and it's meant to be a little bit quicker and fast-paced, you have the Gambit system there to help you control the other characters and help automate things. That's also the problem, though, is because everything becomes far too automated, and you're basically just on autopilot for the entire game. Case in point, beating the final boss without touching the controller. That's just unacceptable for me for a Final Fantasy. And yes, I know I didn't need to do it that way. I could have easily handled everything myself, but I just wanted to see if I could beat the final boss without touching the controller, and so I did. That being said, I was actually a little bit more sour on Final Fantasy XII until I played Final Fantasy XIII and realized how nice the Gambit system was as a gameplay mechanic. And I wish I had it in 13 and had more control over my characters and what they were doing in combat. And so Final Fantasy 13 is what made me look back on 12 and be like, that was actually pretty interesting. And so I think someday I might actually go back to 12 and give it another go. And try things a little differently, have different character setups, different Gambit setups, maybe go a little bit more into the hunts or whatever, the end game, things like that. I might give it another go sometime, because it is more interesting than I initially thought. It could have, however, been far more interesting. The Gambit system could have been far more fleshed out, and the license boards could be completely reworked to actually be compelling in any sense. But, Final Fantasy 13, Final Fantasy 8, I don't think I'll ever replay. But Final Fantasy 12 now is where we get to the point where it's like, alright, I might replay that someday. Alright, number 10 is Final Fantasy 2. So, for Final Fantasy 2 and Final Fantasy 1, I played them on the Game Boy Advance versions, the Dawn of Souls or whatever. So that definitely influences my opinions of these games. If I was playing 1 and 2 on the original NES, Famicom, whatever, yes, I probably would have liked them less. I don't know to what degree, as I've never played them on NES, but I would have liked them less. The Game Boy Advance versions were just definitively superior. Final Fantasy 2 is where the series really started to come into its own thing. We have a lot of introductions here for staples of the series, such as Chocobos and Moogles and Cid, Dragoons, different, all these different sort of terms and things like that come into play in Final Fantasy 2. And it's the first game, I think, that you can really be like, yeah, this is Final Fantasy. The story sort of started to come to the forefront. You have, these characters that have an identity. You have NPCs that you're meant to sort of connect with a little bit, and side characters that come into play, and blah 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 blah. The problem with that, however, is the gameplay systems itself, the leveling mechanics, the skill progression. Final Fantasy 2, if you didn't watch my playthrough, basically kind of works like the Elder Scrolls games, where if you have a character that uses an axe in combat during a battle, they get better using an axe, or better with a bow, or if they use white magic, they get better with white magic, and they get more MP because they need to use white magic. And so this allows you to sort of craft your own jobs. You can have the main dude, okay, he uses a hammer, so he's really good with hammers, but he also dabbles in white magic, so he can use some little bit of white magic. But this character, she uses a bow a lot, and she's only interested in the bow. But this character, he's full on black mage. He's using all black magic. He doesn't care about weapons or anything like that. Whereas this character, he's got like half black magic, but he also uses a sword. And when you first hear about this concept, you're like, wow, that's really great. That's really cool. You can make all your own jobs and do things. Well, here's the problem. Well, one, I pretty much described like every option to you. That's really the extent of it. It's pretty much weapon type, white magic, or black magic. That's really sort of it. So it's not as robust as you want it to be. And the real problem is just, I guess the magic system, really. For your melee characters, whatever. They pick swords throughout the whole game. They use swords. They get better swords. And they are always doing sword damage, and it's great. Spellcasting, though, is where it really comes into problem, because each spell has its own level. And so it's not like many of the games in the series where you learn fire, and then you get fire 2, and then you get fire 3. And then later on you might get holy, and it's like super powerful, or ultima, or meteor, the things like this. And it's just like, oh man, these awesome spells. It's not quite like that. You start with, fire and thunder and stuff like that, and it does pretty much what you'd expect. And then the more you use each individual spell, it levels up. And so if you use thunder over and over and over, it eventually becomes like level 5, and its graphic changes, and it becomes the equivalent of Thunder 2 or Bolt 2 or whatever you want to call it. And that's all right, I guess. I thought that was cool when I first heard about that. I was like, oh man, your spells like grow more powerful as you become more proficient with throwing thunder at people. And that's fine and dandy, except when you get into the other spells that you don't use quite as much. Such as, Protect and Shell, which you might only use on boss battles. Or, Dispel, or Reflect, or Toad, or Stop, or Haste. Haste you might use it more, but, because you're not going to use these spells that often in just your regular play. It's not like your sword guy, who is using his sword in every single battle you do in the entire game. You might not be using Protect every battle. Except now, because it levels up with you, and you want to keep it powerful to keep it relevant, because the miss chance, I think it has something to do with, like, if you're casting a spell on a high-level target, but the spell is not high-level, it doesn't have as much of a chance of working, and blah, blah, blah. So it's like, okay, I have to grind out my spells. And so I have to go into battle and over and over and over and over cast Protect and Shell and Haste so I can level them up. And it's just so tedious. And then you get Ultima, and you get Holy, and you get Flare. But they start at level 0, which means they do like 10 damage. Keep in mind, you get Ultima and Flare and stuff at the end of the game. And it does like 10 damage. It's completely worthless at that level in the game, unless you grind it out and you get it more and more and more and more powerful. That's the only way it's useful to you. And I like grinding. I do, but that's stupid grinding. That being said, though, it's still, the Game Boy Advance version at least, it's still just an enjoyable, old-school 2D Final Fantasy to go through, to power up your characters and just fight all these different things. It's just the Final Fantasy that's the type of Final Fantasy that I just enjoy. You can throw any of that type of shit at me and I'll probably enjoy it. So it's the worst of the 2D Final Fantasies as far as the main series is concerned. But still pretty decent. I'll probably give it another playthrough at some point. Alright, number 9 is Final Fantasy III. This is the last one that I finished due to me losing my save. Again, this is just another 2D Final Fantasy that is good. It's just enjoy. If you use a walkthrough, use maps, stuff like that, you use super speed, it's just a fun experience to play through. This one, you actually get different jobs that you can experiment with. Now, if you follow walkthroughs and stuff like that, they're going to be very crystal clear about which jobs you should do at which points. I wouldn't mind experimenting with some other jobs. I think you have to really overgrind in order to make them usable. But, I wouldn't mind giving them a shot. Again, it suffers from some sort of some limited game design as far as abilities and things like that. You're pretty much either a melee guy or a black mage or a white mage, but it's one of those games that I really wish got a proper 2D remaster rather than the 3D remaster, which I'm not even going to touch. Or 3D re-release, I guess. Remake. If it had gotten a Game Boy Advance style treatment, Wonder Swan, whatever, could have been a really awesome experience if they tweaked some numbers and stuff. It is very grindy. It's a difficult game. I would probably rank it as the most difficult Final Fantasy in the series. Not that that's saying an incredible amount, but a decent game. Definitely not perfect, but the level progression, things like that, were less frustrating to me than 2, and so it ranks a little bit higher. All right, number 8 is Final Fantasy, the first one. So this ranking, again, is based on the Game Boy Advance version. If it was just the original NES version, it would rank quite a bit lower. Because the idea of not having your attacks auto-target after an enemy dies, and they just miss, that's just... I didn't want to play that. I just did not. So it might rank lower than 13. Maybe not. Close. It'd be hovering around there. But the Game Boy Advance version is much better, thankfully. And so it ranks number 8. It's the first Final Fantasy. It's very simple. There isn't really much to say. You pick your job at the start of the game, and that's it. And for the most part, you're either a melee dude, a white mage, or a black mage. That's it. And there's really a beauty in that simplicity. There's no like complicated formulas or anything like that going on. Subsystems, all that stuff. It's very clear. You're just getting more powerful very linearly. And you get some new equipment. And you're just killing bigger and badder things. Again, this is a game, if I was going to recommend it to anybody to play, which I have, I would absolutely say use a walkthrough. I mean, there's just some insane leaps of logic you're supposed to make. Unless you talk to every single person, which some people might enjoy. I don't like that, but some people might enjoy that. And even then, I don't know if everything isn't told to you. But yeah, it's 2D Final Fantasy in its purest form. And there's just something enjoyable about that. It's quaint, but it's just nice. Especially, again, the Game Boy Advance version. They got nice sprites in there. You got nice music. It's just good. I liked it. I enjoyed it quite a bit. Number 7. Very opposite end of the spectrum. Final Fantasy 15. Yeah. So this game is very beautiful. It's very stunning. You know, you're running around there and you see something and it's just like, holy shit. You know, that is what a Malboro looks like. That's what a behemoth looks like. That's what Titan looks like. You know, in just an incredible scale and 3D goodness is really impressive sometimes. You know, it's a fantasy adventure in its best represented form. So that's really impressive. That's a big part of why it ranks so high. Gameplay-wise, it's solid, I would say. The leveling system could have been far more advanced. There could have been far more options for building your characters and constructing them. But I think they just didn't want to have, like, I don't know, this is the white mage. This is how you build a white mage. This is how you build a black mage. Or this is how you build this type of character and this job. It all comes down to pretty much like weapon choice, but most of your characters are locked in what weapons they can use. A lot of it's very locked in and linear and stripped down. So leveling progression and gameplay choices and things like that, that's where this game sort of hurt for me. I would have liked just way more options for how to handle combat and things like that. I'm hoping, 16, if they go with a similar style, they go way harder on game, like leveling options and things like that. But the world just impressed me a lot. The gameplay was fast and frenetic and didn't really get old too much by the time I finished the game. The interactions between the main characters were by far the best in the series, as far as for feeling natural and organic. It was just an enjoyable experience. It's very different for a Final Fantasy game. If it's up to me, and if I was at Square Enix, I'd say, hey, you guys should start working on a new 2D Final Fantasy, just like the old days. But I know that's not realistic, and so for what they put out, for the direction they wanted to go in, I think Final Fantasy 15 is certainly a very fine game. And I'm sure I'll play it again someday, just to go back and explore that world some more. Find some stuff I haven't seen before, because there's a lot in there I have not seen. All right, number 6 is Final Fantasy IX. Final Fantasy IX, when I finished it, I said it was the most average of the Final Fantasy games. And yeah, it pretty much ranked right in sort of the middle here. It doesn't do anything really that bad. Like, there's not anything huge I can complain about it, but there's not anything it does that another game doesn't do better. There's just not anything that incredibly awesome about Final Fantasy IX. It's certainly a very solid Final Fantasy. Like I said, there's nothing really wrong with it. It's got, the ATB system, turn-based that I like. It's the Final Fantasy type gameplay that I like. Leveling is pretty clear, and then you get to, get all these different abilities from equipment, so that's pretty interesting, although at the end of the day, you're pretty much just going to get every ability that's useful, and it's not really that difficult. But you get different characters that have different innate abilities, which is really important. A character can do something that no other character can do. And they can do it often. That's really, like, going back to Final Fantasy VIII, that was my problem. No character, like, any character could do anything that another character could do, except for limit breaks, which were only when you were low on health. I liked the characters. Steiner was a pretty great character. Zidane was fine as a protagonist. Freya was pretty good as a Dragoon. She doesn't rank among the worst of Dragoons. And I even liked Aiko. I thought she was pretty funny. It's got a perfectly fine story. Of course, it goes pretty wild towards the end, like any Final Fantasy game. It's perfectly fine. It's perfectly average. It's the most average of the Final Fantasies. I'm sure I'll play it again someday and maybe have a different roster of characters to go in with that I focus on, just to give it a different try. But yeah, it's not that bad of a Final Fantasy game at all. But it's not really in the upper echelon either. All right, number 5 is Final Fantasy VII. Yes, I know. For some, it may rank as number 1. But for me, it's number 5. And really, it comes down to gameplay. Like I said, don't care about story. Maybe it does have the best story. In fact, I would even say it's top 1 or 2 for story. From what for what I care. I the first time I beat it, I was like, yeah, that actually has a pretty good story, which is not something I normally would ever care about or say. But yeah, Final Fantasy VII is decent. Yes, it's weird and Japanese and sort of I don't even know the words. I'm like dime store psychology and just philosophical nonsense, whatever. Point is gameplay though. It's good. Again, it's a lot like 9, where it's just like, this is the type of Final Fantasy gameplay that I enjoy. So by default, it has a certain degree of respect. But again, much like Final Fantasy VIII, no character is really that unique, except this time limit breaks are something you can build up. You can hold on to a limit break for when you need it, which you could not do in Final Fantasy IX. So that was a bummer. But Final Fantasy VII, you can have a limit break stored for quite a while. Yeah, it replaces your attack, but that's livable. The materia system is pretty interesting. I like the idea of, this character building up certain materia, and they're leveling it up. And it's like, okay, this character, they've built up their fire spell. It's super powerful. And then they can just hand that off to another character and be like, all right, yeah, I'm going to use this fire spell. That was really unique, because no Final Fantasy game had really done that before. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really do anything that entertaining. The materia system, there isn't that many options. Especially like for the first half of the game, there's really almost no materia that's even there for a non-magic character. You have like sense or steel or death blow. I don't know. There's just not that much there. And even throughout the whole game, there's just not that much for melee characters to do other than limit breaks or maybe double cut or something, slash all, I don't know. And so everyone sort of dabbles into magic a bit, and it's fine. It's perfectly fine. I've beaten the game twice now, which I didn't expect to ever say, but yeah, I've beaten it twice, and it was fun both times, and I enjoyed it. I like the Golden Saucer. I like the story. I like a lot of the characters. It's a pretty damn good Final Fantasy, but it's not as good as the next 4. So that's the way of it. Number 4 is Final Fantasy 4. Whoa! No, I didn't plan that either. Final Fantasy 4 is better than Final Fantasy 7 because it's 2D. That's it. Pretty much that's it. I mean, maybe that's really shallow and stupid of me. That's just the way it is. I'm sorry. I just like 2D better than 3D. It just works my brain. It tickles my brain in a way that I enjoy. Maybe it's just pure nostalgia. It just harkens back to an earlier time in my life when I was less bitter. I have no idea. But I just like it. I also like that characters, for the first time in the series, they have their own unique abilities. Yang has, the kick ability. No one else gets the kick ability. Only he gets it. That was a first, and that was good. Only Kane gets the jump. Also, he was a high wind. That's the best. So, only he gets the jump ability. Only Sid gets the scan ability. I don't know. I really liked Cecil's progression from a Dark Knight into a Paladin. Final Fantasy IV was the first game in the series to have a main character. Like, Final Fantasy IV did so many big things for the series. And so many of them were right and good. It's not as good as 6. I mean, obviously, you haven't heard Final Fantasy VI listed yet. because that game just does everything better, as far as I'm concerned. But it's just really the perfect evolution of Final Fantasy. Bringing it to Super Nintendo in just the perfect way. Everything was pretty much better from the previous games, and it's really just a great RPG. And it was very important for the future of the series, and it still holds up. I had never beaten that game before, and it still holds up. Number 3. Top 3 now. Here we go. Number 3 is Final Fantasy V. Yes, number 5, right after 4. Number 5 was different because they went back to the job system. Very similar to Final Fantasy 3. In a lot of ways, 5 is almost like a remake of Final Fantasy 3. They took the job system where you have 4 characters throughout the whole game, and you could assign any job you wanted to any of those 4 characters. You could have all 4 be the same job. You could have 4 mage characters. You could have 4 melee characters. You could do all sorts of things. But unlike 3, where there were jobs that were just statistically better than other jobs. Like, this is just a better black mage than the last black mage job. 5 really wanted to diversify and give you lots of different options. 5, I think, is one of the best games in the series as far as character options is concerned. 5 easily has some of the best gameplay in the series for me, because especially replayability. That's also an important thing. And there's the 4-job Fiesta, which is a testament to the replayability of Final Fantasy V and the options you have, where you can play through and beat the game with any combination of jobs. Anything you can imagine. People have done it. 4 white mages. People have done it. I know people have done that for the first game as well. Whatever. And probably the third game. But anything you can imagine, it can be done. And that's so interesting to me because there's so many different combinations of jobs. There's just a slew of jobs in there. And the way that they interact, you get the sub-abilities and just... Oh, it's so good. It's definitely a departure from the way 4 did things, where you had characters with specific abilities, and I talked about this a lot in my playthroughs of those games, of the difference narratively between, like Cecil being a Dark Knight that becomes a Paladin, whereas opposed to you choosing jobs for your characters and it doesn't mean anything. There is a big difference from a story standpoint. Yes, 4 is better. From a gameplay perspective, there's no competition. 5 is just that good as far as gameplay is concerned. So there might be a pretty big gap for the rankings between Final Fantasy 4 and Final Fantasy 5. Like, my top 3 are very clear that these are just incredible. And I'll replay these anytime. Anytime. For me to replay Final Fantasy 4 or any of the other games in the rankings, yeah, I have to be in a pretty specific mood and be like, all right, I'm gonna give 4 another go. But these, Final Fantasy 5 and the next 2, any time of the year, just let's go, let's do it. Yeah, it's fantastic. I recommend Final Fantasy 5 to anybody. Great stuff. Again, I'd probably still use a walkthrough, but great stuff. But this was a tough one to make. But number 2 is Final Fantasy X. Yes. Again, if you're going to shit on Titus or the story or anything like that, I do not care. I don't. It could all be like MS Paint and just cardboard cutout. Like, I don't care. Final Fantasy X is my number 2 because of the gameplay. I would say it is the best in the series. The gameplay of Final Fantasy peaked with number 10 and went downhill from there. Final Fantasy X removes the ATB system, which has been in place for years, going completely turn-based, which is awesome. And the sphere grid, Now, Spoonie shit on the sphere grid. And I can understand why. If you play the original North American PS2 version of the game with the default sphere grid, it's not that incredible. It's not like, holy shit. Things are pretty clearly laid out for each character. They're meant, Titus is meant to become this fast, speedy melee guy. Auron is meant to be the big, meaty, big hit kind of guy. Yuna is meant to be the white mage. Lulu is meant to be the black mage. And yeah, there's not many options there. However, the international version, the remastered version on Steam and stuff, that lets you really open up the sphere grid and do anything you want with it. Mods that you can get for Final Fantasy X that can randomize the sphere grid and switch it up in all sorts of different ways. It's just awesome. Not only that, but the end game of Final Fantasy X is the best in the series. At least as far as I'm concerned. Again, opinion. But the stat maxing process, the monster arena, the dark aeons, I love it. I love it all. I've gone through the monster arena process like 4 times now, and it does not get old. So between randomized sphere grid that give you just limitless possibilities for characters, you can do anything you want with them, the gameplay turn-based entirely that really allows for strategic decisions, and the whole endgame process, it is the best gameplay in the series. It just is. Now, 5 does come close as far as options, but not quite as good as 10. Come fight me. Go ahead. Alright. And number 1, no surprise to anybody. It was my number 1 before I started this whole playthrough series. And it's my number 1 at the end. It has not changed, sad to say. And that's Final Fantasy VI. Final Fantasy VI represents the best that Final Fantasy has to offer. When I think the words Final Fantasy in my head, it is of Final Fantasy VI. Maybe that's due to nostalgia. Like I said, it's pretty much my first Final Fantasy. And I think the first Final Fantasy for most people really resonates with them. But it just represents the best. Like I said, 10 has the best gameplay. It does. 6 is not as good gameplay-wise or replayability-wise as 10. It isn't. But 6 is the full package. It has everything you want in a role-playing game. It's got the story. It's got the characters. It does have good gameplay. And it is replayable. I've replayed it many, many times. It's got the graphics. Just this beautiful pixel art. Old school sprites. The music. Oh my god. You have any idea how many remixes and remasters and all this thing that people have done with the music? I don't know. It's just the perfect package for a role-playing game. It's a perfect culmination of every game before it. And playing through the first 5 games, you can see all the steps that brought to Final Fantasy VI. And it's like, yes, this is it, up on the pedestal. Number 1. And then they went 3D and they started making all these changes, and some were awesome and some didn't quite work so well. But 6 will always remain as the best that the series has to offer, I think. I would love for my mind to be changed. I'd love for Final Fantasy 16 to come out and be like, what? What is this? Is incredible. Breath of the Wild for Zelda came pretty close to dethroning Link to the Past. And I think nostalgia is a powerful force here. I'm not going to lie about it. Nostalgia is probably propping up Final Fantasy VI up there. But, I mean, it's something I'm not going to get tired of. I will be 80 years old, and I'll still go back to Final Fantasy VI. There's nothing else that really needs to be said about it. If you are a fan of RPGs at all and you've not played 6 yet, I don't know if there's any help for you. Yeah, so that's it. Like I said, Final Fantasy has been a part of my gaming life for decades. There's a lot of memories that I have associated with Final Fantasy. To a certain degree, I enjoy every game in the series. You know, when I'm just sitting there, especially, you know, the 2D ones, like I said, when I'm just sitting there doing some old school kind of gameplay and just going through dungeons and stuff like that. And, you know, playing like just Final Fantasy 3, the last one I did. Just going through with these old school graphics and doing this old school, you know, select each action things that, you know, some modern gamers would just scoff and turn their noses up. I just like that. That's just my thing. So you know, the series is really just far, far gone from that at this point. But, I have an appreciation for the entire series, the whole franchise. They have their ups, they have their downs, they do things wrong, but it's such an important series to gaming and to me personally. I'm really, really glad that I did this whole playthrough thing where I played through all the games. You know, I'm never going to be like a fanatic about Final Fantasy where it's just like, oh, I have a whole, you know, shelf full of Final Fantasy stuff and I post on forums and I get a tattoo of Titus's face or, you know, I'm never going to be like that kind of person. But yeah, as far as video games go, it might be my favorite series. I mean, the Soulsborne series is up there, but I don't know if I have as many, like, just emotional memories and connections with Final Fantasy. You know, growing up with my brother, who's also a huge Final Fantasy nut, and we were playing these games as just kids and stuff, and growing up with the series. Yeah, I don't know. I guess it might be my favorite video game series. Pretty crazy stuff. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed this hour-long rambling ranking of the Final Fantasy franchise. You know, I guess it's not a series that I can recommend to every single gamer. It's definitely, you know, for people that prefer, you know, you have to either like story in video games and character development and dialogue and all that, or you have to be able to ignore it or accept it tolerate it. You have to like, I mean, that's the thing about Final Fantasy is if somebody asks, you know, what's a Final Fantasy game like? It's like, well, which one? There's so many different ones that provide so many different experiences and different types of gameplay, especially with 15 in there now, which is radically different. Final Fantasy 5 and Final Fantasy 15 are very different games. It's not quite the series that has something for everybody, but you know, it's been around for a long time, and it's a pretty important game series to the hobby. All right, I guess that's about it. I'm done rambling, and I'm done with the Final Fantasy series until 16 comes out. I know there are some other games that I wouldn't mind throwing in there sometime in the future. I wouldn't mind playing through Mystic Quest, because we did have that when I was a kid. We did play that. That's a pretty quirky title. Final Fantasy Tactics is easily one of the best games in the series. I'd probably rank that above 4. But I just played through that, so I didn't want to play through it again. There's some other ones that might be interesting, but yeah, for now, I guess we're done. So, my name is Mangg. This has been my ranking of the Final Fantasy franchise, and I will see you fine folks around.